This is World Watch's program number 829, October the 26th, 1987. Before I begin, I want to say that the views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or board of directors, and of course that includes for people that call in on the talk show part of the program. We want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you the following hour of World Watchers. And also the following hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. I got a lot of telephone calls last week from people who enjoyed the poetry of Robinson Jeffers. So to begin the broadcast that I'm going to do this evening, which is a continuation of various scandals in Washington, one large pack of lies after the other, I decided quickly to just read you an appropriate poem that Robinson Jeffers wrote in 1945 called Tehran. Now, there's a whole new generation listening to World Watchers who may think this has to do with the Iran-Iraq conflict. This has to do with the meeting of four heads of the large governments before the final days of World War II. The people meeting were Winston Churchill, who was already making deals with British intelligence, William Stevenson, and our OSS, just by way of background, to incorporate Nazis into our society immediately after the war was over, including Nazi war criminals. Another person at that famous Tehran meeting was Franklin Roosevelt, who would die shortly, and then President Truman was ready to swing right into the formation of the CIA and the National Security Council that have been our undoing ever since. Also at that conference was Chiang Kai-shek, who immediately after the war turned the Chinese army against the Chinese civilians, just as France used Clarence Barbie, and we did in other countries, to go against the resistance movement. And Chiang Kai-shek was working with the Japanese war criminals as soon as the war was over to wipe out the people who resisted the Japanese entry into China, believe that or not. And then there was Joseph Stalin at this meeting. So the pilot for this conference at Tehran was L. Fletcher Prouty, who wrote a book, The Secret Team, and has been trying to expose government corruption for the last 10 or 15 years. And he drove Franklin, he took care of the plane, flew him to Tehran and back, working in the Air Force. The poem by Robinson Jeffers, just before the war was over, is called Tehran. And this is what he said. The persons wane and fade. They fade out of meaning. Personal greatness was never more than a trick of the light, a halo of illusion. But who are these little smiling attendants on a world's agony, meeting in Tehran to plot against whom and what future? The future is clear enough in the firelight of burning cities and the pain light of that long battle line. That monstrous ulcer reaching from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea, slowly rodent westward. There will be Russia and America, two powers alone in the world, two bulls in one pasture, and what is unlucky Germany between their foreheads. Observe also how rapidly civilization coarsens and decays. Its better qualities, foresight, humanness, disinterested respect for truth, die first. And it is the disinterest in the respect for truth that I'm going to talk about this evening. Now, the first truth or untruth that was in the news of major importance for me and my research, and also for another researcher named Bill Kaysing, who wrote the book We Never Went to the Moon. There's an article in the Houston Post, October 14th, just a week ago, titled Former NASA Worker Recalls a Foul-Up on the Moon Walk Photo. The article says the famous photographs of the first moon landing, believed by many to show Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the lunar surface, aren't photos of Armstrong at all. Years of detective work, and this has taken many years, have confirmed what the chiefs of NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center, to their horror, suspected on the night of July 24th, 1969, when thousands of reporters demanded a photograph of the first moonwalk. Everybody wanted one picture. They wanted the first man on the moon. They wanted the best picture of them So it had to be Armstrong who put his foot down there, the first person on the moon. And Mr. Duff recalled how he found out that it wasn't Armstrong's picture at all. The 3 crewmen of Apollo 11 were then locked at that time into quarantine. This is for about 3 weeks. After the return from the moon in 1969, NASA finally decided that they had to disturb them. I was the guy who had to call Armstrong, Duff said, that night and wake him up. I certainly felt uneasy and apologetic at that stage, bothering anybody, but we simply couldn't find any picture identifiable of Armstrong. I'm reading this with great interest, and for those of you who don't understand why, I've had Bill Kaysing on my radio program before. He wrote the book, We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle, and all of these lies I have to share this evening with you that are in the news this week have to do with some reasons why our economy is going hell backwards, with a lot of unexplained reasons and debts for nothing that we've invested. This was called the $30 billion swindle. Back to the Houston Post, this gentleman said, I remember the conversation and will for the rest of my life, Duff said. I said, Neil, we need a picture. When did you hand the camera to Buzz Aldrin? He said, I never did. There is no picture of the first man on the moon. The only photographic evidence that Armstrong ever stepped onto the moon comes from a 16-millimeter movie camera bolted to the lunar module hatch, and that camera only produced familiar fuzzy image of Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Richard Underwood, NASA's photographic expert in Houston from the early 60s until 1985, said he searched and questioned the astronauts for several years, could never find a historic picture of Armstrong with his moonwalk. Whenever you try to bring it up, either one of them, they just won't comment on it. The one camera was hooked on Armstrong's suit. You have to get it off. You'd have to give it to the other guy. You'd have to have a conversation. And that famous picture was supposed to be Neil Armstrong on the moon. The mistake was brought about by 2 changes in later missions. They corrected that and got a picture of somebody, supposedly we'll have to believe, on the next mission up there. But no conversation was ever recorded. They never said anything about switching cameras. There never was a question about the camera. Moonwalking astronauts had individual cameras to make sure they photographed each other. It was so difficult identifying Aldrin in photographs. Underwood said NASA officials discussed releasing Aldrin's picture and calling him Neil Armstrong. But they decided that the space buffs would spot the deception, and also the commanders wore red stripes on their suits starting up on the Apollo 13 flight. Now, I called Bill Kaysing last night. He lives in SoCal, California, part of the time, and he said Seattle the rest of the time. He said Armstrong has been a recluse. He's written a book about the way the astronauts have hidden, refused interviews, gone crazy, mentally sick, or isolated for years. He said he will not talk about the Apollo at all. They've tried to talk to him about it. He wouldn't talk to Bill Kaysing, and he will never discuss the Apollo. He says that's a while back. Well, I talked about We Never Went to the Moon. This was in 1984. It was September 3rd, 1984, World Watchers number 665. And in the introduction to Bill Kaysing's book, this is the way it begins. Quote, apparently a substantial number of Americans do not believe their government landed on the moon, said David Weiss in The Politics of Lying. This is a well-known book that came out in 1973. On June 14, 1970, the Night newspaper published an astonishing story based on interviews with over 1,000 persons, 1,721 people interviewed didn't really believe the U.S. astronauts had been to the moon. The government has been silent about this. There's been enormous secrecy and a harvest of massive public distrust. Now, how this book came to be written, Bill Kaysing puts in his introduction. I'm not going to share much of it with you tonight, just a few points to illustrate one of many, many, many lies and big expenses this government had. He said, during the summer of 1969, I was living in Santa Barbara. I had worked 7 years at Rocketdyne, the firm that built the main propulsion units for Apollo. I could not work up the least bit of interest in the entire astrophysical circus. I decided I did not believe that Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin or anyone else was going to the moon, and consequently I could not generate any enthusiasm for watching a phony performance. Since the summer of '69, the feeling and belief that man's journey to the moon is still in his future became stronger. And as the years passed, I find myself comparing the Apollo flights to other incidents in American life, like Watergate was an outstanding example and a striking point of comparison of government lies. And the energy crisis was another lie, like the Apollo simulation. And then the book goes into details. Why did the Dutch newspapers in 1969 question the authenticity of the moon landing? Why is that NASA's Apollo records are not classified, but they're also not available to the general public? The answer to requests on this is, quotes, Apollo material not classified but unavailable. Why did so many astronauts end up executives of large corporations? Why did some of the astronauts die in accidents? Others suffer brain damage. Others have had nervous breakdown. Was this rate of attrition higher than should be expected with carefully selected and trained individuals? And he goes into other questions and then into the scientific parts about the Apollo simulation and described it as a military project, that the real purpose was to turn NASA into the Defense Department. And in 1965, the Air Force was going to use a modified Gemini spacecraft and turn it into an orbiting laboratory. NASA passed itself off as peaceful, but the entire operation was a Department of Defense payload. And he goes into the military aspects and that this was a military operation passed off as a civilian operation. I got out my book, We Reached the Moon, after seeing this article about not being able to have a single picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon. This was the official story of the moon landing, written by John Noble Wilford of New York Times, and the New York Times published this book, the same publishing company that did the Warren Report, that was another huge, massive lie a few years in 1963, that was, and this goes on to 69. And in the entire book, there's not a single picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon. It begins on the mention of him on the moon is on chapter 20. On the moon at 10:56 on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped into history from the bottom rung of the ladder leading down from Apollo 11's spacecraft. He reached out his booted left foot and planted the first human footprint on the moon. Then he uttered the long-awaited words that we are sure to be immortalized. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And, of course, we're leaping from there to the Star Wars, which will be the first strike, the goal of the Third Reich, to control the air and space and thereby controlling the world. Another big lie has to do with why are we in Iran? What are we doing there? The question was asked by the foreign correspondent whose column is carried in the San Francisco Chronicle and also the Houston Post, William Pfaff, and I quote him many times, P-F-A-F-F. Today's article was, are we going to war with Iran? And he brings up the point that every day we get closer to the war, that the President of the United States and the NSC and the Defense Department made early claims that the U.S. Navy entered the Gulf merely to protect neutral shipping, and that they are following the actions which would make it safe for the waters to be used for shipping without a tax. And he wrote it as perfectly plain that we are there serving Iraq's war interests, while Iraq can remain at liberty to attack the shipping that bears Iran's oil exports and arms imports. And remember, Iraq hit our ship, the Stark, and that was the reason for going into the war against Iran at that point, using Iraq to hit us. And then we say, oh, now we've got to get Iran. And William Pfaff makes the point that war is now the direction in which the United States now moves, not toward a big Iran-American war, which might settle things, a bloody war at a cost the Americans are, he says, the Americans declined to pay, or would decline a big war, but keeping a little mini war. And he's saying there are two questions you have to ask: what is the cause of this war, and is this war worth a war, a larger war? And the second, will it settle anything as far as these issues go? But the lie was in Europe, where he's writing from Paris, it's perfectly obvious that to keep the waterways safe for shipping oil back and forth is not the reason at all, but we're heading towards a war. Now, the Los Angeles Herald had a story this last week, October 20th. Pentagon keeps pool reporters sitting in the hotel. This is the press pool. And the important thing is that a war can start, and we will not have any press people to observe how it got started. I've mentioned this many times before, and it was Admiral Poindexter and Michael Ledeen and Robert Brown from Soldier of Fortune and the team that managed the grenade invasion that began keeping the press away and said, we will select the press people to observe. We'll handpick them in advance, and so they can be on the site. And now the people that would be watching the Gulf are sitting at a hotel by a pool, swimming pool, where they are the press pool that should be in the Persian Gulf to see if we start our own war, as I've said, identical to what Adolf Hitler did with Agents Provocateurs when he went into Poland and created his excuse. This article says, while the U.S. Navy destroyers shelled 2 Iranian oil platforms yesterday in the Persian Gulf, members of a Pentagon-organized news pool sat in a hotel with nothing to do. It was a familiar experience for 5 journalists who were assembled September the 30th, almost a month ago. In that period since, the pool has been permitted only 1 visit to a Navy ship, a 2-day trip that was scheduled for 6 days. The journalists were denied access to the scene or information after American helicopters sank an Iranian speedboat. Days later, the Navy provided 4 poor quality photos of 2 captured speedboats, certain background features that had already been doctored by the United States Army. Some pool journalists say they believe the Pentagon wants coverage only when it appears to suit their official purposes. After the 1983 grenade invasion, where American journalists were officially barred from covering this invasion, and the motives were covered up also for us going in there, a commission called the Seidel Commission was set up whereby the military would choose people to cover military events. The Pentagon set their own rules, and now they're not even sending people to the Persian Gulf to see what is going on. Pool members say they are not sure where in the military system the obstacles to their coverage lie. Where in the military system, obviously with the liars who want World War III, that's where it happens. But they are complaining that thousands of dollars are spent for them to sit at hotels in Miami and in Florida and not to be able to see what is going on in the Persian Gulf. There are some over there in Bahrain and Manama also, but they're not able to see the action and never given the go-ahead. Now, that kind of secrecy came out earlier and was reaffirmed October 14th in the Wall Street Journal. An article titled, "Military Commanders Were Excluded from the Initiative in Iran." That was the arms that were sent to Iran by the National Security Council and Oliver North and Admiral Poindexter, and the many, many weapons that were sent to Iran, which I'm sure they were coaxed or persuaded to use or believed they were safe to use, and then that is our excuse to come back and call them the international terrorists, and the purpose was to force them to release hostages so Reagan would be reelected, not he, but his members of the House and the Senate in 1986, and that would have made a difference. Judge Bork would be in if all of those wishes of Reagan's had happened at that time, but the hostages weren't released, and the Defense Department was not included into these actions, just as the military are not included. Now, a very interesting and controversial subject came up about Edwin Meese and that company, that Wedtech Corporation, that gets you into what is happening in the Gulf, and with Mr. Pfaff's article in Paris, coming from Paris today about war in the Persian Gulf. October 16th, 1987, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, and the San Francisco Examiner had articles on the subject of Edwin Meese and Wedtech Corporation. And the probe of Wedtech is enlarging now to cover Meese's influence in the Persian Gulf. And some highlights of the articles are, I'll start with one of the articles and go through several of them. Investigators are looking into the activities of Attorney General Meese in connection with a San Francisco Friends effort to secure government backing for a pipeline in Iraq, an oil pipeline in Iraq. The sources say investigators for independent counsel James McKay have been questioning several people recently about the involvement of E. Robert Wallach, W-L-L-A-C-H, Edwin Meese's personal attorney, a friend of Meese, and part of the Iraqi pipeline project. Investigators are trying to determine whether Meese introduced Wallach to U.S. officials involved in the project in 1985, while the White House was arming Iran. Edwin Meese and his friends, Lynn Nofziger, one of Reagan's closest friends, Meese, one of his very closest, were sending and arranging a $1 billion pipeline for Iraqi oil, while the other side of the story, you always hear that's the other side of the story, was sending the arms to Iran. This article tells about the expanded investigation will be focusing on Mr. Wallach's improperly influenced abilities of government over officials for the Iraq pipeline because of his contacts with Edwin Meese. One matter reportedly under investigation is whether Wallach invoked Meese's name in October 1985 and pressed Alan Gerson, a deputy assistant attorney general in the department's Office of Legal Counsel, for favorable ruling on the pipeline project. The ruling was crucial to the fate of the project that dealt with whether congressionally approved aid for Israel could be used as financing an Iraq pipeline. Edwin Meese taking money that is aid for Israel and putting it into a pipeline in Iraq, and Israel had been mortal enemies for a long, long time against Iraq. This is identical to the Camp David Accord when the members of EATSCO, that corporation with Edwin Wilson and Eric von Marbart and Thomas Kleins and Theodore Shackley, and that wonderful gang made millions of dollars off of, instead of sending arms to Egypt, they were sending them PLO. And the article goes on to say some witnesses have told McKay, the special prosecutor, that they were unaware that Mr. Wallach, Meese's attorney, had this stake in the pipeline at a time when he was pressing the case for the project and presenting himself for Meese or for the National Security Council. They are now investigating Meese's dealings with the Wedtech Corporation that violated federal conflict of interest laws. Wallach, who was hired by Bronx, New York's company, and he's also Edwin Meese's attorney, asked Meese to review the company's bid for a defense contract, and Meese directed his staff to review this proposal. It was a no-bid contract for Wedtech, and it involved Lynn Nofziger, a former White House political aide of Ronald Reagan. Also, he was very close with Richard Nixon administration, and he's a business partner of Helene von Damme. The LA Times goes on with this horrendous story. At the press club in LA, these issues were brought up, that the investigation of Meese has widened into the ill-fated Mideast oil pipeline project. And to make it even more horrendous, not only using Ronald Reagan's name and the Reagan administration in 1985 to promote the U.S. construction of a proposed pipeline to carry Iraqi oil to a Jordanian port, which came close to the border of Israel, but has nothing to do with Israel, but Israeli funds were going to be used. McKay is investigating Meese's role, and the contract was to go through, by way of Mr. Wallach, Meese's attorney, to a representative, a Swiss businessman named Bruce Rappaport, who was in partnership with Bechtel Corporation of San Francisco, the giant engineering firm, in hopes of building the $1 billion pipeline. Think of that. The head of Bechtel Corporation, the two heads of them, one is Caspar Weinberger, who's pushing this war in the Middle East, pushing it for all he can squeeze out of it every single day. He now wants to reflag every ship around there with the American flag. He was an officer of Bechtel. George Shultz, Secretary of State, an officer. They were chairman, attorney for Bechtel Corporation. They, under the table, were sending arms to Iran to make Iran appear like the mad, the crazies, and also to get our hostages out. So if Reagan's cabinet congressmen were reelected and the Republicans were in, both Schultz and Weinberger would be assured no further investigations. There wouldn't have been an Iran-Contra hearing. There would be Judge Bork on the Supreme Court. But lo and behold, it's Bechtel Corporation with Schultz and Weinberger and Edwin Meese taking money by way of recommendations of the National Security Council. In this article, uses the name of Robert McFarland, who was involved in this, to build a pipeline for Iraq, favoring Iraq all the time for their oil, protecting their oil. This article says Edwin Meese and his wife Ursula invested $55,000 in a trust fund with W. Franklin Chin, who's a director of Wedtech Corporation, and they would be helping get the pipeline going. Meese withdrew his investment from Chin just June of 1987 after all the Iran-Contra came down and he was being investigated under that scandal, but he had it tucked in with his holdings was under this Wedtech Corporation. Wallach acknowledged lobbying Meese on behalf of Wedtech, a small defense contractor that ultimately won a $32 million Army engine contract without competition. And the first story of the pipeline inquiry was covered just this past Friday, a week ago, in the New York Times, and you'll hear more about it. Another former Reagan administration official said that William P. Clark, that's Ronald Reagan's close buddy and McFarland's predecessor as National Security Advisor, was asked by Wallach, the attorney for Meese, who's on the board of directors of Wedtech, in 1985 to lend his support to the pipeline. Clark was the National Security Advisor who turned down Maurice Bishop, didn't want to help him, and that gave us the excuse to invade Grenada. So Ronald Reagan's close friends are involved in this. Tom Flynn, a vice president of Bechtel, said the firm ultimately gave up the project after Wallach failed to obtain Israeli guarantees that would not attack the pipeline. It was money for Israeli aid that was going to making an oil pipeline for Iraq, and Israel wouldn't guarantee that they wouldn't blow up the pipeline. And would you blame them? And so they stopped it because Israel wouldn't say that they wouldn't blow it up. By July 1986, Iraq was building two other shorter pipelines that would make the larger project less valuable. In October 1985, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, remember that name because next week I'm going to do a little bit more on that. It insures investments abroad by American corporations. They asked the Justice Department to determine if Israel could legally use congressionally approved foreign aid funds toward such a financial guarantee. They asked the Justice Department to determine if Israel could legally use these funds, but the funds were just supposed to go from Israel to the Iraq pipeline the other way around. So our whole Iran-Iraq confrontation, which is now costing $1 million every single day, is part of our lies. Another major lie in this whole story, there's several parts of this, is the Star Wars story with Mr. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, who quickly surprised the entire Defense Department and wrote a speech for Ronald Reagan, March 23, 1983, introducing the Star Wars that was another billions and billions like the moon, the Apollo program, and it would make us safe from every kind of a weapon. It would catch them as they all come to us and bounce it back. And he also helped write a 1986 speech for Ronald Reagan on the new laser that was part of the Star Wars program. So many of you probably saw the articles this week. I'm going to cite one from the San Francisco Examiner, Wednesday, October 21st. U.S. misled on the Star Wars, the ex-programmer said. Edward Teller, known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, was too optimistic, and he misled national leaders about the chances of developing the Star Wars X-ray laser weapon. Roy Woodruff, who resigned in 1985, was an associate director for defense systems at Lawrence Livermore Lab. He registered his grievance, and he said there was improper conduct by Robert Batzel, B-A-T-Z-E-L, director of the Nuclear Weapons Lab. He alleged that Batzel had failed to correct overly optimistic, technically incorrect statements by Edward Teller that would allow for a weapon system that probably wouldn't be safe, that would cost millions, maybe into several billions of dollars, and they knew at the time that it wasn't safe. What happened to Mr. Woodruff was that he was fired and dismissed and then taken back on the job. He wrote to the president of the University of California, that university is in charge of Lawrence Livermore Lab, and objected and said that his grievance came about from December 1983 through October 85, when Edward Teller and Wood engaged in numerous actions and undercut his management responsibility, and again were overly optimistic, technically incorrect, and about the research, and the nation's policymakers were listening to Edward Teller when he was telling us untruths about the safety of Star Wars. I'll take a 1-minute break now, and then we'll get back on to some of these lies, including the Star Wars lies, the moon lie, the Gulf, the Persian Gulf lie. Why are we in the Persian Gulf? And these things are what are really hurting our economy. We're talking about billions of billions wasted. I will do maybe 1 hour. I would like to do 1 hour on the economy and not cut it up in pieces. A lot of you would like to talk about it, and we can on the talk show part of the program. But in the meantime, I'll continue with this part of World Watchers, and we can cover that later if you want to call in and talk about it a little bit. An article from the San Jose Mercury this past week, a call for the General Accounting Office to look into the Livermore laser. And then the San Jose Mercury, the newspaper that represents Silicon Valley, and a lot of the Defense Department had an editorial cover-up at Livermore, dissent at the lab for science and taxpayers' sake, should be encouraged. Dissent at the lab for the sake of taxpayers should be encouraged. And the article goes on, without presuming to know who's right or wrong, it is serious business when the former head of arms development at Lawrence Livermore Lab accuses two well-known Livermore physicists, and one of them is Edwin Teller, who's also on the board of Western Goals and Helionetic, a company that finally went under but stood to make a lot of money and made a huge amount when Star Wars plan was announced in 1983, and he was on the board. And this editorial said that other lab scientists have charged the management with distorting information on nuclear testing. An independent Livermore report was critical of another Star Wars program, the kinetic kill vehicles, and that has been suppressed since August. And Livermore's record makes us suspicious. The editorial said the lab is suggesting that this is a free speech issue, and they declined to muzzle Teller and Wood about their opinions on the laser and the X-rated laser, X-rated, but the cover-up is horrendous, and this editorial cites other problems with Livermore Lab. Then a large article, again, the San Jose Mercury, Teller misled the officials of Star Wars. Reports in the journal Science and elsewhere said Teller met with Ronald Reagan, it was in 1984, not 86, and persuaded him to boost funding for X-ray laser research. He also was credited with helping inspire Reagan's 1983 decision to pursue the Star Wars concept. He also did it alone with Ronald Reagan. He gave Reagan a speech literally written by Edwin Teller that took the Defense Department by surprise on the Star Wars, and this is the way the Joint Chief of Staff were taken by surprise that Ronald Reagan and Poindexter North were arming Iran, and the others before him, Bud McFarland and the whole gang, were in on sending the arms to Iran. So the secrets are from the Defense Department, where the secret team, the super Cs, may I call them, this little pocket, have their own shenanigans using billions of dollars. And this article concluded, one of them in the San Jose Mercury, that Reagan's vision of a leak-proof shield that renders nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete is not a realizable vision. It was not a realizable vision, and the people who wanted the money were lying. And another article from the LA Times that Mr. Woodruff, who complained about these matters, went to the head of the University of California, and they told him to perfect or rewrite his complaint to them to make it look purposefully cumbersome and bureaucratic. This is a scientific matter of billions of dollars into Star Wars that won't work, and they know it. They told him to write it in a way so that it wouldn't sell on 60 Minutes. Make it cumbersome, technical, and so that it won't sell on 60 Minutes. It's something you're not supposed to understand. If you put it in plain terms, and Mr. Roy Woodruff, formerly of Lawrence Livermore Lab, spelled it all out with a press conference and said, this is what's happening. And he got this memo to present something so that it wouldn't sell, so that it would be highly technical and in matter, not for other people, lay people, to understand. And Edward Teller did say February this past year that Star Wars is imperfect but necessary, that it won't shield everything we need it for, but it's necessary. It's necessary for contracts. It's necessary for jobs. And that's what it's really necessary for. Now, Jack Anderson had an article just this morning in the Monterey Herald called Embarrassing the Boss. And this is very important because a former member of Congress has just written a book, an important book called The Arms Control Delusion, about the Star Wars and Defense Department. It's scheduled for release next week, co-authored by Senator Malcolm Wallet, a Republican from Wyoming, and Angela Codevilla. The two were sponsoring an anti-missile defense program, and they claim that Ronald Reagan is way off and knows he's off on the Star Wars. And the interesting thing about this that Jack Anderson noticed is that conservatives breaking with their party's president are not unusual, but using words from his own secret documents to lambaste him certainly is. Now, I was saying to somebody yesterday regarding the cost of living or expenses that researchers better start saving their money because just as with Watergate or more so, when Ronald Reagan is out of office, there will be so many books on this man and this administration that the libraries could have one separate section, just as the cartoons at the time of Watergate. You could have the organized crime section, the Watergate section. This administration is going to be embarrassed this week with a book coming out, and one of the co-authors is from the Hoover Institute on the Stanford University campus. And they quoted Ronald Reagan, who said, "I've carefully evaluated the price that the U.S. must pay for keeping our Star Wars program within the bounds of current plans. I weighed these costs against our overall national security requirements." And what Wallop and Codevilla said is very, very important, and Jack Anderson quoted them from their book. They don't buy the assurances that the president is giving. They don't believe what he is saying. And they wrote that the president's words, in the quote, this is a quote, are not those of a democratic leader who rules by convincing people to do the right thing, but of a bureaucrat who either does not care, he does not know what he's doing, or he does not care, or he is ashamed of the reason why he is doing these things, but who nevertheless wants the people to give him authority and money, and really resents being asked about specifics. Authority and money. That's the moonshot. That's the Iran-Iraq war, the Gulf confrontation. That's the Star Wars. These are the lies that we have been fed since World War II, when Robinson Jeffers said the first casualty is truth. That's what comes down. And he knew when they met at Tehran that they were already cooking up these disasters. Now, along with the Star Wars lies, there was a large article in the Miami Herald, reprinted in a lot of the newspapers, titled Probe in Washington. The United States used, and this is National Security Council and White House, used the media to help the Contras. Propaganda was illegal. And this article goes into the Office of Public Diplomacy for Latin America and the State Department and the offices of Otto J. Reich. Do you like that name? R-E-I-C-H, the U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, who was chief of public diplomacy starting in June 1983 until January 86. And the General Accounting Office said that William Casey and these people were publishing material that was absolutely and patently false. Now, one of the things that IBC, that International Business Communications, was involved with Oliver North, with Carl Spitz Channel, was to defeat the congressman who voted against Star Wars, get them out of Congress so that they could have all their money and their billions and perpetuate the lie. This article is a full-page article, or rather half a page from Miami Herald, that the direction was run off by a memo March 13th, 1985, by Patrick Buchanan, the White House Communications Director, called Confidential Eyes Only, that outlined white propaganda operations. And this had to do with sending money to the Contras, that there were Soviet weapons in Nicaragua, and also defeat those pro-Soviets running for Congress, such as Congressman Barnes from Maryland, who they did defeat, to get out of Congress the people who did not love the Contras and who did not trust or believe Star Wars. And that's a big investigation that should keep going in Washington. The use of lies, white propaganda, to continue to get people elected until we have what they had in Germany in 1933 when Hitler was elected. And speaking of Star Wars, as the economy dropped and the stock market went crazy and the president gave his flim-flam speech last week, this press conference that was so horrendous, and maybe I'll do more about that with you next week, on where he got off the track. He was asked a question, and he went completely off the track and began to lose his mind. I don't know how many of you picked that up. He said he wants Mr. Gorbachev to come to his little house, that 4-bedroom house up on the top of the mountain in Santa Barbara, the Eagle's Nest. It's identical to Hitler's Eagle's Nest. And, of course, it was obvious to the head of the Soviet Union after that speech that not only is the economy bankrupt, but the president is totally insane. And he said the summit is over. It's down by Star Wars. Star Wars is a first strike. The Soviet Union knows it. And Ronald Reagan is only using Mr. Gorbachev to leave the White House with the aura of wanting a peace summit. And he refuses to be used. Mr. Gorbachev will not be used. And that's great for him. Another lie, a horrendous lie that I mentioned briefly last week, was the fact that Kurt Waldheim, it turned out, was his war record was part of the OSS CIA record, that they knew of his war crimes, and that he had worked for the OSS starting in April, just at the time of the Tehran conference when Robinson Jeffers says they were cooking up their little lies. He was writing a poem just at the time these people were indeed cooking up their lies, and they were hiring the great Kurt Waldheim to work for the United States, and he became part of the American intelligence operation. Well, a new book is coming out that was in the newspaper this week, a book referring to Waldheim as his whole life being a lie. The front page of the San Francisco Chronicle says, memoir by ex-UN aide. Book calls Waldheim a lie. Waldheim, the person, is a total lie. And the article says Kurt Waldheim was a living lie, an ambitious mediocrity who caused great damage to the United Nations by covering up his wartime record. Sir Brian Urquhart, a Briton who retired last year from the UN, is Undersecretary General, said that although Waldheim performed better than he was expected to during the 10 years as UN chief, better than he was expected to, even showing courage on occasion, he lacked the qualities of vision, integrity, inspiration, leadership that the UN needed. By covering up his service as a staff officer with the German army group in the Balkans, he has done immense damage not only to his country, but to the United Nations. The book is called A Life in Peace and War, published by Harper and Rao. Waldheim is now, of course, president of Austria. The fact that Waldheim was never tried, Urquhart said, would seem rather to militate against a finding that the former Secretary General was a war criminal. It seems to me the important thing is that everyone was under a total misapprehension about what his war record was. I think that a bogus history of his personnel history is a total disqualification for a responsible office. Urquhart, an intelligence officer with British airborne forces during the war, explained his personal grievances against Waldheim. I spent a great deal of my time defending him with various people against allegations about his wartime activities. I did it on what it turned out to be a completely fictitious basis of the record he gave me. After all, if someone at the UN is caught falsifying his job application, he is summarily dismissed. The new book coming out about Reagan's lies with Star Wars will be out this next week, and Harper and Row is publishing a book, A Life in Peace and War, about the lies of Waldheim. This past October, there were more pieces of information about Waldheim. This one from the Houston Post, October 18th. New evidence of crimes of Waldheim reported. The file on the Nazi roll is locked up in the United Nations office. A locked-up file called Kurt Waldheim, Murder and Other War Crimes contains documents, pictures, photographs, irrefutably placing him as a key Nazi intelligence officer. This is a published report that just came out last Saturday in October. The file, locked at the United Nations building, contains 185 documents, witness statements, photographs, captured Nazi documents, placing Waldheim as a key intelligence officer of Group E of the Wehrmacht High Command for Southeast. The unit, based in Salonika, Greece, was in charge of security of the Balkans from 1943 to 45. It was documented by the 1947 War Crimes Commission as being responsible for atrocities against Yugoslav partisans, deporting 40,000 Greek Jews to their death camps, the abuse of Americans and Allied prisoners. Prosecutors at the Nuremberg crimes trial said the Nazi euphemism special tasks that Waldheim was in charge of was used for unwritten orders of torture and then execution. On August 1943, the memo from Waldheim and his immediate superior, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Warnsdorf, recommend the execution of Yugoslav partisans captured from 3 villages. The memo appeared to be in reaction to a January 16, 1943 meeting with Adolf Eichmann that brought together the Nazis for the final solution. And keep in mind that Adolf Eichmann's superior, the head of the Romanian Iron Guard, in the early 50s was being brought to the United States, first to New Jersey to work for Elmer Bobst, the head of the pharmaceutical, the Warner Lambert. Elmer Bobst, the godfather of Richard Nixon's career. He worked for Cabot Cole. Henry Cabot Lodge ran as vice president with Nixon and lost to John Kennedy in 1960. And Nixon wanted that election, lost to John Kennedy in 1960. And then he came to California to head that Transcomputer International that became International Imaging, that was bought by Albert Hakim and General Secord, that became Stanford Technology Training Group. So while the Adolf Eichmann was soon to be hung in Israel, and this Waldheim was to become head of the United Nations, a partner in this group. Von Bolschwing was in California, where he lived until 1981, died in 1982. This Houston Post said that the United Nations controlled archives also contain at least several names of government and industry leaders today who are in the West who have denied their secret past, but it's locked up in the archives. The debate continues in the United Nations whether to release this information. Why is this information important now? I've talked many times about the 2 largest robberies in the world that took place after the war, not the robbery, but the taking of money from Germany, all money from the banks in Germany, and put in Switzerland and then disseminated and began to be dispersed in the 1950s with Otto Skorzeny out of the banks of Madrid and Switzerland. And the Third Reich emptied out all their money and said, if you want to fight Russia, if you want to fight them, you have to do the arming, and Germany did not put money into that. These projects are the projects that have bankrupted the United States. Japan took all of their money out of their country, and the top Japanese persons under the emperor, persons never tried for war crimes, took all of their money and invested it, gold and cash and whatever, the loot from all over the area that they took and conquered, and put it away for the future. And our banks have been emptied of our cash, our liquidity, so that we have to rely on Taiwan, that was formed by the late Chiang Kai-shek, and Japan, that worked closely with Chiang after the war. Foreign countries are paying our loan, and we have literally been cleaned out. And these things were planned, carefully planned, and described in many books, and the economy can go backwards very quickly because of the arrangement of these people. It'd be nice to know if some of those several names in government and industry have any fingers in some of the market jumping that you're going to see take place in the next 3 or 4 years, if not this year. And then finally, Ronald Reagan, who never gets tired of dirty little tricks, and Thomas Buchanan, his buddy, who never gets tired of dirty little tricks, they made a cute one this past August 19th, just several weeks ago. He's appointed Henry Anatol Grunewald, a Jew, to be the new ambassador to Austria. The first Jew appointed by Reagan lasted about 3 months, came home with what was supposed to be a heart condition and died of a cancer. I was suspicious of that. That was Mr. Cummings, a long supporter of Ronald Reagan. He honored him, Theodore Cummings, with being ambassador to Vienna. Then, of course, it went to Helene von Dahm, the secretary for Otto von Bolschwing, Eichmann's superior, translator, helped put money into that corporation in California, worked for Reagan, appointed people around him for 8 years, appointed them around him for 2 years, became ambassador to Vienna. She lives in Vienna, and she's now married to one of the wealthiest men in Vienna. So for a short time, we had Ronald Lauder as ambassador to Vienna. He's coming home, and Reagan has put Henry Grunwald, described in the New York Times. Mr. Grunwald, who resigned Monday as editor-in-chief of Time magazine, is a Jewish native of Vienna who fled the Nazis in 1940. A fact that as recently as 1985 would have drawn only a polite mention as a future ambassador to Austria. But now this situation has come up, the New York Times said, where he has to either shake the hands of Kurt Waldheim, the Prime Minister of Austria, and that will be quite a confrontation. The article says the prospect of a Jew presenting his diplomatic credentials to President Waldheim for official accreditation as the United States ambassador to the government of Austria unsettled Mr. Grunwald enough to cause him to consult not only with his old friends but several American Jewish spokesmen. He wrestled with it, Mr. Grunwald said, for advice from former ambassador Saul Linowitz. A senior administration official said that Mr. Grunwald, 64 years old, had conversations with a variety of Jewish leaders before he decided to go forward, and he was concerned about the Jews opposing his selection as ambassador to Austria. But again, I think that the team in the White House, the Buchanans and the Fritz Kramers and so forth, are just laughing their heads off to send a Jew to Austria. At the same time, a book is coming out about Kurt Waldheim by the person representing it under him at the United Nations, and the information coming out that Waldheim's whole lie was a lie, and he sent 30 or 40,000 Jews to their death, and this is our new ambassador to Austria. One point about the New York Times that is very subtle and interesting. This article is August 19th, 1987, by David Binder. The Jewish spokesman consulted by Mr. Grunwald apparently see that he should, I guess, go ahead and represent him, that he's dealing with the president as a friendly country and not what he did in the past. And they quote Abraham H. Foxman, National Director of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. He said, I'm proud of this appointment, proud that the United States decided with Waldheim as president of Austria to send a Jewish ambassador, a Jewish refugee, as an ambassador. I hope they will receive him as an American and not a Jew. Well, those long listeners to World Watchers might remember about 2 years ago, I had on the program that Abraham Foxman, this gentleman who's so proud of the appointment and head of the ADL, took a trip to Switzerland with Fritz Kramer and a gentleman from the Associated Press, Howell Buell, at a time when money from Klaus Barbie was to be deposited in the bank account of Joseph Mengele. Just to backtrack for you new listeners, there were allegations that, and I was told by persons who used an airplane to go South America, that the pilot on that plane, Mr. Hetrick, had been arrested for bringing in cocaine from Klaus Barbie. That was the cocaine that John DeLorean had in the hotel room. Barbie took the money for that cocaine and gave it to Hal Buell, vice president of Associated Press, and he went to Switzerland and met the attorney for Joseph Mengele, who was indeed very much alive, and put that money into the Nazi account of Joseph Mengele. And Abraham Foxman duplicated that trip. As a matter of fact, it was when I put this on the air that this friend of mine who had given me this information and who works in the State Department said that they were absolutely furious that I had this on World Watchers, and referred to me as the Jewish bitch out there is caught on to what we're doing. Those were the words I got a call from friends who had given me the information in the first place and said, guess what? We know what you're doing because they're complaining back there in a certain office that you have mentioned this on the air. So the same Foxman is saying, isn't this great to send this Jew to see Waldheim at a time like this? You have to ask, whose side are they on? Now, another lie that's come about and isn't hushed up yet and hasn't had a solution has to do with the condition of Mr. William Sessions, nominated to be the new FBI director. And I do and would like to spend another whole hour on the links of William Webster and William Sessions to the murder of John Kennedy and the Martin Luther King assassination done by the same people and groups. The New York Times had an article, and it was reprinted in some of our papers. Sessions' ailment is called a mystery. And in an intestinal examination of the newly confirmed director of FBI, William Sessions, was made today. They found nothing at all suspicious, but the tests say that the recent intestinal bleeding remains a mystery, that he doesn't have the ulcers they said he did. He's been hospitalized twice, first in Washington, then in San Antonio. The bleeding of the intestinal tract is a mystery. There are a variety of causes, but it isn't the ulcers they said that he had. They said the cause is quite unclear, but they don't know what it is, and you shouldn't be suspicious. They use the word suspicious in the New York Times. Philip Shannon wrote, he's already had 2 pints of blood. He was admitted to Washington hospital for treatment of bleeding ulcer, but that isn't what it is. There's no plans right now to give him any more blood, but it would take at least a month for him to recover, and it is a mystery on why his stomach is bleeding. And then for a article, my concluding article for this evening is titled, "The CIA Chief Favors a Long-Term Service." In this article, if you can have a one-upsmanship, is the chutzpah of the week. CIA Director William Webster, this is from the Washington Times, October the 9th, has told reporters that he thinks the director of the CIA should be on a long-term basis, just like the 10-year term at the FBI. He was there 10 years and then was out. He doesn't think the CIA director should be changed when the new administration comes in. If the Democrats are in 1988, he thinks he should stay 10 years. And boy, can I believe he should, with all of the CIA involvement in the Iran-Contra and with Oliver Buck Rebel of the FBI working with Ollie North and the National Security Council and the FBI working with the Iran-Contra group going against the Boland Amendment. He says that the CIA directorship shouldn't change every time a new president is elected. To tie it to the electoral process is troublesome to me. You can better believe it's troublesome to him, because new investigations might open up, like the Iran-Contra just scratched the surface. And remember, after the Watergate story, when Jimmy Carter came in after Nixon and Ford and that Watergate team, he had Stansfield Turner appointed to the CIA, and he cleaned out about 200 people that became the nucleus of the Iran-Contra secret team. Theodore Shackley, Thomas Klein, Chichi Quintero. All those rotten people were cleaned out when Jimmy Carter came in, were brought in by Ronald Reagan, and now William Webster wants to continue for 10 years and cover up the Reagan-Iran-Contra for 10 years. This is a horrendous story that defies description, so I'll just leave it at that. And also, as CIA director, he rehired one of the Iran-Contra people whose name is Jose Fernandez. He also uses the name Thomas Castillo, the CIA man in Costa Rica. He rehired them now. He's given a job in the headquarters instead of dropping him for his CIA work in Costa Rica. Against the Boland Amendment, William Webster has hired him, kept him on at the CIA, and he wants to stay on to cover up for years to come. This is something we must push and not allow to happen, that the director changes with the administration, and particularly with this very rotten administration. Now, I'll take a 1-minute break and just play a little bit more of that new song, A Cut from Sting. I like it very much. They danced alone. I'll play a section of that, and then 375-3082. You can get to the telephone, and I'll be back with you, and we'll take some questions, and you'll have a chance to tell me what you're thinking about.